My uncle has always been the type of guy who loves adventure, and one of his favorite things to do is ride dirt bikes in the desert with his friends. They rent a few trailers and camp out for a few days, driving their bikes through the rough, sandy terrain, finding little trails, and sometimes just riding aimlessly through the open desert. It's something he looks forward to every year. He says the quiet and the vast emptiness give him a kind of peace, and I've been out there with him a couple of times, watching, enjoying the heat and the sun, and the way the desert stretches endlessly in every direction. One trip they took, it was early spring. The desert was still waking up from the cold, but the days were already getting hot. They set up camp in a small clearing among some rocky hills, away from any other campers. It was about a mile to the next closest camp, which was a cluster of trailers and tents down a dusty trail winding through the sand dunes. That first night, after a long day of riding, they built a fire to cook some food and warm up when the temperature dropped. The fire burned down to glowing embers late into the night, and eventually, they put it out before going to sleep inside their trailers. The desert at night was cold, silent except for the occasional coyote howling far away. The next morning, my uncle was the first one awake. He stepped out of the trailer just as the sun was rising, the sky still pink and orange. He was going outside to start the generator that powered their little setup lights, the coffee maker, and to charge their phones. As he opened the door, something caught his eye right away. There was a man sitting in one of the folding chairs they had brought. The man was just sitting there, head down slightly, hands resting on his knees. The fire pit was still there, and the fire they had put out last night was smoldering quietly. A thin line of smoke drifted up in the cool morning air. What struck my uncle was how out of place the man looked. He wasn't part of their group, and there was no vehicle nearby. No dirt bike, no truck, no ATV, nothing. They were a good mile or more from the nearest other camp, and there was no trail close enough that a person could have come through easily, at least not without being seen. My uncle's first thought was that the man must have been wandering around all night, but the idea of someone just appearing out of nowhere like that in the middle of the desert felt strange. Instead of panicking, my uncle decided to wake up the other guys. He went back inside and started knocking on their doors, telling them to come out and see who was sitting there. One by one, they all came out, rubbing sleep from their eyes, squinting into the morning light. They stood around the stranger, watching him carefully. He finally lifted his head, looking groggy and unsteady. The man didn't say much at first, just mumbled a few words about needing a ride back to his camp. One of my uncle's friends offered to take him, figuring the guy was probably lost or maybe had gotten separated from his group. The desert can be a tricky place, and it's not uncommon for people to wander off or get stranded. Still, there was something about the way the man moved and his expression that felt off. The ride to the other campsite was dusty and slow. They drove over sandy hills and rocky paths, the sun climbing higher and hotter in the sky. The man sat quietly in the back of the truck, staring out the window with glassy eyes. My uncle noticed the smell of alcohol, faint but unmistakable. The man's clothes were dirty and wrinkled, and his boots were worn, as if he had been walking for a long time. When they reached the other camp, my uncle saw a few state troopers standing by the trailers. The man was immediately taken in by them. Later, my uncle learned what had happened. The man had been drinking heavily the night before and had somehow managed to steal a golf cart from the nearby resort area. He took it out into the desert, riding it through the dark, uneven terrain. But midway through the night, the cart ran out of gas. Instead of waiting or trying to find help, the man got off and started walking, stumbling through the sand in the cold desert night until he found the camp where my uncle and his friends were staying. The whole situation made my uncle uneasy. The man was lucky to have ended up at their camp rather than somewhere more dangerous. Walking alone in the desert at night, drunk and without a vehicle, is a recipe for disaster. The desert can be unforgiving. Cold when the sun goes down, hot and dry during the day, and full of hidden dangers like rattlesnakes, sharp rocks, and uneven ground. My uncle told me that night how the whole event had shaken him more than he expected. It was a reminder that the desert, for all its beauty and silence, can be a dangerous place if you're not careful. People might think of it as just empty sand and rocks, but when you're out there, you realize how easy it is to get lost or hurt. And when you're drunk or impaired, your chances of surviving drop fast. The story didn't end there. After the state troopers took the man to a nearby hospital for a checkup, they found out he had minor injuries, some scrapes and cuts from falling, mild dehydration, and a concussion from a hard fall he couldn't remember. The man was lucky to be alive. The troopers told my uncle that they often find people in the desert like that. People who underestimate the wilderness or take risks they shouldn't. My uncle and his friends kept their camp for the rest of the trip, but everyone was more alert after that. They checked their surroundings carefully, kept their equipment close, and made sure to stick together when riding. The incident made them all realize how fragile safety can be, even in places they thought they knew. When they came back home, my uncle said he couldn't stop thinking about the man sitting quietly in that chair, lost and stumbling through the desert. It wasn't just about the danger of the desert or the man's poor decisions. It was about how close he had come to a real tragedy. One wrong step, one moment of confusion, and the story could have ended very differently. That trip left a lasting impression on my uncle. He still loves riding dirt bikes in the desert, but now he respects it more than ever. He told me that the desert demands respect, not just from the weather or the land, but from every person who steps into it. It's easy to think you're in control, but the desert has its own rules, and ignoring them can cost you everything. The story of the man at their camp is something my uncle shares with anyone who'll listen, not to scare them, but to remind them to be cautious, to stay sober, to plan ahead, and to never underestimate how hard it can be to survive even a short night lost in the desert. In the end, the man was lucky because my uncle and his friends were there, awake and alert at the right moment. It could have been anyone out there, a stranger with no way to call for help, no idea where to go, and the desert closing in around them. And sometimes, it's the people who show up when you least expect them that save you. The desert isn't just a place for fun and adventure. It's a place that tests you. It shows you how quickly things can go wrong, and how important it is to look out for each other. My uncle still rides his dirt bike every year, but he always makes sure someone knows where he is, and that he's never riding alone. Because the desert is beautiful, yes, but it's also real. It's full of dangers that don't come with warnings or signs. Just the cold, hard truth that survival depends on respect, preparation, and sometimes a bit of luck. I never planned to go camping that weekend. It was one of those impulsive ideas, my brother, his roommate, and I just deciding out of nowhere to pack up some gear and head to a nearby state park that was supposed to be pretty quiet and remote. None of us were really experienced campers. We just wanted to get out of the city for a night, breathe some fresh air, and maybe tell some stories around a fire. We didn't bring much, just a couple of tents, some sleeping bags, a small cooler with a few beers and sandwiches, and some basic camping gear. My brother brought his pistol too. He's the kind of guy who likes to be prepared, especially when we're heading out somewhere isolated. I wasn't crazy about it, but I didn't say much. It's his hobby, and I figured it might come in handy just in case. We set up camp in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining bright. We made a small fire, roasted some hot dogs, and talked about nothing important, just enjoying the calm. The air smelled like pine and earth, a nice change from the city's usual mix of car exhaust and concrete. It was peaceful in a way that's hard to explain until you're actually there. After a few hours, we all got tired and crawled into our tents. I zipped up my sleeping bag and tried to fall asleep, the sounds of the forest around me. Crickets, the occasional bird, and the soft rustling of leaves, lulling me into a kind of calm. But then, a few hours into the night, I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud banging sound. It was coming from outside, near our tents. At first, I thought maybe it was a tree branch hitting the side of the tent, or an animal moving around, but then the banging turned into something different. A series of heavy thumps and what sounded like someone shouting or screaming. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I could hear my brother's voice next to me, low and tense. He was awake too, and the roommate was stirring as well. They were both listening, frozen in their sleeping bags, waiting. The noise was getting closer. I heard footsteps crunching over dry pine needles and gravel. Then, a loud scream pierced the night, followed by more banging on the tent fabric. like someone was trying to get in. My brother grabbed his pistol off the ground next to him and cocked it quietly. "We're sleeping," he whispered firmly. "Go away." The banging stopped for a moment. I held my breath, heart pounding, as the footsteps slowed outside our tent. Then I heard the sound of a heavy object being dragged or slammed against a tree, metal clanging hard against bark. The man outside was clearly agitated or high on something. His screams were wild and incoherent, and every few seconds he would yell out some words I couldn't make out. We stayed quiet, hoping he'd just wander off. But after a few more minutes of him banging around, a voice shouted from the darkness. It was calm but firm, telling the man to drop the pole he was holding. Then suddenly we heard what sounded like tasers, crackling electricity, and a loud thud as the man fell to the ground. The whole thing happened fast. My brother uncocked his pistol but kept it ready just in case. Moments later, I could see flashlights moving between the trees. The cops had arrived. I wasn't sure how they found us or the guy, but it looked like they had been tracking him for a while. One officer came over to talk to us briefly, explaining that the man had been reported wandering the area, causing trouble for other campers. They said he was heavily intoxicated or possibly on drugs, and he'd been acting erratically for hours. After the officers took him away in handcuffs, the noise and tension faded, and the forest settled back into its natural rhythm. My brother and his roommate finally relaxed, laughing quietly about the whole thing. It was strange, surreal, waking up in the middle of the night to some random stranger screaming and banging around your tent like that. Not scary in the usual sense, but definitely weird as hell. We sat by the dying fire for a while, talking about what had happened, sharing a few nervous laughs. None of us expected the night to turn out like that, but somehow it made the trip memorable. The next morning, the sun was bright, the air fresh and cool. We packed up our things, a little tired but still in good spirits. My brother joked about how the guy probably needed a serious detox, and the roommate said he'd never go camping without some kind of protection again. I thought about the man who came stumbling into our camp that night, how lost and scared he must have been, even if his behavior was wild and unpredictable. It reminded me that the wilderness isn't just about nature and quiet. Sometimes, it brings out the weird and unexpected parts of people too. The trip ended without any more incidents, but I kept thinking about how close we were to something that could have gone badly wrong. The guy had a pole, he was yelling and banging, and none of us knew what he was capable of. My brother's calm reaction and quick thinking with his pistol probably kept us safe. Looking back, that night stands out not because it was terrifying in a classic sense, but because it was so strange and unpredictable. We were just three guys trying to enjoy a simple camping trip, and instead, we got thrown into a real-life drama we hadn't prepared for. I still tell the story sometimes, especially to people who think camping is always peaceful and easy. It's not. The wilderness can be calm and beautiful, but it can also be strange, wild, and full of surprises, some of which come not from the land or the animals, but from other people. I'd always thought camping was supposed to be relaxing, getting away from everything, spending some time in the woods, just me, my dog, and the crackling fire. That's what I was expecting the night it happened, but it turned into something else entirely, something I can't forget. My dog, Rex, was no ordinary pet. He was a big, muscular German Shepherd mix, strong and alert, with an instinct that always seemed sharper than mine. I didn't train him much for protection, but somehow he took it upon himself to be the guard dog. Whenever someone came close to the property or the camp, he'd stand tall, lower his head, and stare at them. Not a bark, not a growl, just a slow, focused stare that made you feel like he was measuring every move, every breath. It wasn't an aggressive stare, more like a warning, a quiet way of saying, "I see you, don't get closer." We'd been out camping a few times before, but this trip was supposed to be different. It was just me and Rex, out in the middle of nowhere, away from any other campers or trailers. I picked a small clearing surrounded by thick trees on all sides, deep in the woods about 2 hours from town. The kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind in the leaves and the crackle of your fire. No roads nearby, no distant city lights, just darkness and silence. We got there around late afternoon. I set up a simple fire ring with stones I found nearby and gathered wood while Rex ran around, sniffing and exploring the edges of the clearing. The air was dry but cool, the smell of pine heavy and fresh. I sat down by the fire and tossed on some dry sticks until the flames grew bright and warm. Rex lay down beside me, head resting on his paws, his eyes watching the trees. The sun was setting, and the sky turned a deep blue, then black, with stars blinking faintly through the branches. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. I pulled out a small camping chair, stretched my legs, and leaned back, watching the fire's glow flicker against the shadows. Rex stayed calm, but every once in a while, he'd lift his head and glance toward the dark tree line. I didn't think much of it at first. Dogs can be nervous in the woods, especially when it gets dark. Then, about an hour after nightfall, something changed. Rex stood up suddenly, his entire body stiffening. He didn't move toward me or bark. Instead, he turned slowly, his head lowering, eyes locked on a single spot beyond the firelight, deep inside the trees. The way he stood was strange, like he was both curious and cautious, almost as if he was waiting for something. The longer he stared, the more I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't normal for him to be so still and focused for that long. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it was just a deer or some other animal moving in the woods. But Rex didn't shift his gaze. Not a flicker, not a blink. For almost 5 minutes, he held that exact stance, frozen in place, staring into the pitch-black tree line where I couldn't see a thing. The firelight danced, but it didn't reach far enough to show anything beyond the clearing. All I saw was the outline of trees, thick and shadowed, silent except for the occasional rustle of wind-blown leaves. But Rex wasn't hearing the wind or the usual forest sounds. His attention was locked on something else, something unseen but real. That's when my skin started to crawl. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. My heart picked up a beat, thumping harder and harder, like it was warning me to be alert. I kept watching Rex, who stayed perfectly still, his body tense, like a statue. I felt my breath catch, every noise around me suddenly louder. The snap of a twig somewhere in the distance, the soft hoot of an owl, the flutter of leaves. My eyes scanned the dark woods. I saw nothing moving, no glow of eyes reflecting in the firelight, no shape or shadow creeping near. But Rex knew. Whatever it was out there watching us too. For those long minutes, the silence was suffocating. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was expecting. It was thick, heavy, filled with tension and waiting. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, as suddenly as he had frozen, Rex relaxed. His muscles eased, and he lowered his head, turning to look at me briefly before lying down again beside the fire. The moment passed, but my unease didn't. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe a deer had just been moving cautiously, or some small animal nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. Something that Rex could sense but I couldn't see. I sat up straighter, shifting the firewood around to get the flames brighter. The warmth from the fire felt like a small comfort, but I kept glancing over my shoulder toward the blackness. The shadows looked different now, deeper and more alive. The rest of the night passed slowly. I didn't sleep much, my eyes darting between the fire and the trees. Rex stayed close, quiet but alert. Every time I thought I'd relaxed, his head would snap up again, ears twitching toward the woods, his stare returning to that dark edge. When dawn finally broke, washing the sky with soft orange and pink light, I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. The woods looked normal again, friendly even, but I couldn't forget the way Rex had acted. It wasn't just instinct. It was something more, something real and threatening. I packed up quickly, ready to leave. As we walked back to the truck through the crisp morning air, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet woods and the early light. Back in town, I checked with a few people who knew the area. They told me stories of hikers and campers seeing strange figures at the edge of the woods, or hearing odd noises at night. Nothing official, no reports of danger, but enough tales to make you think twice about what really hides in the darkness. I've been camping since then, but I've never forgotten that night. Rex's stare wasn't just a reaction to a stranger or an animal. It was a warning about something out there, something silent, watching, and waiting. It wasn't a ghost or some fairy tale monster. It was the wilderness itself, raw and unpredictable, holding secrets that even the best eyes can't see. And my dog knew it better than I ever could. That night changed how I look at the woods. What seems quiet and calm might be hiding something unseen. And sometimes, the only thing between you and whatever's out there is the steady, unblinking stare of a dog who's learned to watch closely and wait. It started as a normal backpacking trip. My group, 3 of us, had planned the route for weeks. We wanted to get away from the noise of the city, disconnect from everything, and just be in the wilderness. The cabin we were aiming for was old but sturdy, nestled in a dense forest about 8 miles in from the nearest trailhead. We had our packs loaded, maps checked, and spirits high. The first day went smoothly. We walked through thick brush, crossed small streams, and climbed steep hills. The air was fresh, the kind you don't find in town. Birds chirped occasionally, but otherwise, the forest was quiet in a way that made you listen harder to every sound. We reached the cabin by late afternoon, tired but satisfied. It was a small wooden structure, weathered by years of rain and sun, with a fire pit just outside and a small clearing perfect for tents. After setting up our gear and collecting firewood, we sat around a modest campfire, eating simple food and sharing stories. The sky darkened quickly that evening, and a storm rolled in. Rain started to patter on the roof and the tent's fabric, the wind howling through the trees. By 10 p.m., the storm was full force. Heavy rain, gusts shaking the cabin and rattling the windows. We decided to turn in early, hoping to get a good night's rest before continuing our hike the next day. The rain and thunder made it hard to hear anything beyond the walls of our tents and the cabin, and eventually, the storm lulled us into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to an unusual sight. Not far from where we'd pitched our tents, I noticed a second tent, one we hadn't set up ourselves. It was small and simple, pitched near the tree line where we hadn't seen anyone camp before. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Sure enough, someone had set up camp right beside us during the night. I woke the others, and when we all stepped outside, there was a man sitting calmly just inside the tent's doorway. He looked around our age, wore dirty hiking clothes, and carried a pack similar to ours. His expression was neutral but friendly. We were immediately confused. None of us had seen or heard anyone come in after the storm started. With how loud the rain and wind were, it would have been impossible for someone to sneak in without us noticing. Still, the man seemed harmless. He introduced himself without fuss and said he'd been hiking for days, looking for a place to rest. He'd apparently slipped in unnoticed sometime during the storm and set up his tent quietly without disturbing us. He seemed sincere enough, and we decided to let him stay for the night. Despite that, the whole situation felt off. How had he gotten in without us seeing or hearing anything? We were camped far from any trailhead or road. There was no nearby vehicle or sign of recent passage. The storm was violent, and the forest was soaked and slippery. Yet here he was, completely dry and calm, with a neatly pitched tent that hadn't been there just hours before. We spent the day hiking together, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man stayed close, always watching, always quiet except for necessary words. He didn't ask questions or offer much about himself. Every time I glanced at him, I caught a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, an intensity that felt more like waiting than resting. That night, the storm returned. Thunder rolled overhead, and rain hammered the tent like a drum. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds outside and watching shadows shift in the firelight. Rex, my dog, if he had been with me that night, would have growled or stared into the dark. But there was nothing but silence, no signs of any other living thing near the camp. When morning finally came, I was relieved to see the man's tent empty. We searched around but found no trace of him. Not a footprint, no dropped gear, nothing. It was like he vanished in the night as quietly as he had appeared. That's when I realized how vulnerable we had been. This stranger had slipped into our camp without us noticing, stayed the night, and left without a trace. We never found out who he was or where he came from. The forest, no matter how familiar or safe it seems, holds mysteries that don't always have clear answers. Sometimes, the scariest moments come not from monsters or ghosts, but from the unknown people who walk the woods. People who can appear and disappear in the dark, leaving only questions behind. I never really understood what people meant when they talked about being scared of the woods until I experienced it myself. Not the kind of scared you get from movies or stories about monsters hiding behind trees, but the deep, gnawing fear that comes from being completely alone, stripped of everything familiar, in a place that feels endless and indifferent. It all started when I decided to go camping by myself. I've always enjoyed hiking and the outdoors, but this time I wanted to push myself. No friends, no noise, no distractions. Just me, my pack, and the wilderness. The plan was simple. Find a quiet spot, set up camp, spend a couple of nights, then hike out. Nothing fancy, nothing dangerous, or so I thought. The day I arrived, the weather was clear and the sun was warm. I carried everything I needed on my back: tent, food, water, a small stove, and some basic gear. The trail was rough in places but manageable. As I walked deeper into the forest, I could feel the city noise fade behind me, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of birds. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. The ground was soft but dry, and there were plenty of fallen branches for firewood. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a fire. Sitting by the flames, watching the smoke curl into the sky, I felt a calm I hadn't known in a long time. But as the sun dipped below the trees and shadows stretched across the forest floor, something shifted. The quietness around me grew heavier. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, started to disappear. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I had been alone before, even in the woods, but never this deep or for this long. The stars began to appear overhead, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast black sky. I lay back on my sleeping pad inside the tent, listening to the crackle of the dying fire outside. That's when I noticed the first real feeling of fear, not from something visible, but from the idea of being utterly alone. No one to call for help, no one to share the silence with. Just me, surrounded by trees that stretched up and out of sight in every direction. The wind whispered softly, carrying strange sounds that I couldn't place. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, made my heart jump. I told myself I was fine, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining things moving just beyond the tent, shadows that weren't there when I looked. The feeling of being watched crept in, though I knew logically there was no one else nearby. The night passed in fits and starts. I woke several times, every noise setting me on edge. At one point, the wind picked up, shaking the tent walls and making the zipper flap like a loud flag. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the clearing, but all I saw was the familiar shapes of trees and rocks. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved the night was over. I packed up slowly, eager to get moving and put some distance between myself and the spot that felt like a trap. As I walked, I thought about the fear I had felt, not from anything supernatural, but from the loneliness itself. The way it made every small sound feel like a threat, the way it twisted my mind into imagining things that weren't there. I realized then that being alone in the wild was more terrifying than I had expected. It wasn't the dark or the animals. It was the crushing silence, the sense that if something went wrong, no one would come. That day, I kept a faster pace, stopping only for short breaks. The forest started to feel less threatening as I moved, and the sounds of life slowly returned. Birds sang, squirrels scampered in the underbrush, and the wind carried the familiar scent of pine and earth. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead. The sight of cars and people was a relief unlike any I had known. I felt a deep sense of gratitude just to be back among others, surrounded by noise and movement. Reflecting on the trip later, I understood something important. Fear in the wild isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about the raw vulnerability of being truly alone, stripped of the comfort and safety of human connection. That kind of fear is real, and it's something I'll never forget. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, the vast, silent forests, the rugged mountains, the endless trails stretching out under the sky. There's a certain peace out there you don't find in towns or cities, a quiet that feels like it's been around forever, and maybe it has. Years ago, I read something strange about the old days. Back then, people who traveled alone deep into the wild weren't just hikers or explorers. They were almost worshipped, seen as gods walking among men. People believed these lone wanderers had taken human form, stepping down from some higher plane to live among the trees and mountains. It sounded crazy at first, gods disguised as hikers, but the more I thought about it, the more it made a kind of sense. I never saw one of those figures on my own trips until that one night. It's a night I'll never forget. Not because anything supernatural happened, but because what I saw and felt changed the way I look at the wilderness and those who move through it. I was camping alone in a remote forest far from any road or town. I had hiked in all day, my pack heavy but steady on my back. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Birds sang high in the branches, and somewhere nearby a stream babbled quietly. It was perfect, exactly the kind of solitude I wanted. I picked a spot near a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and set up my tent. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the light was fading fast as the sun dipped behind the hills. I gathered some wood and built a fire. Flames crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced on the trunks around me. I sat close, letting the warmth chase away the evening chill. The forest around me felt alive but calm. It was the kind of silence that's never really silent, full of small noises you only notice when everything else stops. The crack of a twig, the rustle of a squirrel, the distant call of an owl. As night deepened, I lay back and looked up through the trees. The stars were bright and countless, burning cold light across the sky. I thought about those old stories, the gods who wandered the wilds alone, silent and watchful. It seemed strange, almost funny, but somehow it settled in my mind like a whisper. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the firelight. But then the figure stepped into the clearing. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a steady gait. He wore simple clothes, sturdy boots, faded pants, a jacket that looked worn from years of use. Nothing fancy, nothing to mark him as special. But there was something about him that made my skin crawl. He moved with a calm, sure confidence. No rush, no hesitation. Like he belonged there, like the forest was part of him and he part of it. He stopped a few feet from my fire, not looking at me but watching the trees beyond. For a long time we just stared, me trying not to look away, him silent and still. The fire between us flickered and popped, sending sparks into the cool night air. I wanted to say something, ask who he was or where he came from, but no words came. It felt wrong, like breaking a quiet rule. So I stayed still, my heart pounding loud in my chest. Minutes passed, maybe more. The figure finally turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing behind but a faint scent of pine and earth. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, calm, silent, a part of the forest itself. I realized then that the stories might be true in a way I hadn't understood. Maybe those old wanderers weren't gods in the magic sense, but something just as strange and powerful. People who had spent so much time alone in the wild, moving through it so completely, they became part of the land itself. Almost like spirits, but made of flesh and bone. In the morning, the clearing looked ordinary. The fire was just cold ashes, and the trees were still and quiet. No sign of the man, but I felt different, like I had seen a glimpse of something older than the world we know. When I got back to town, I asked a few people about lone hikers and old wilderness legends. Some laughed it off, others told stories of men who disappeared into the forest for years, returning changed. I realized that being alone in the wild isn't just about survival or adventure. It's about losing yourself in a place so vast and old that it can swallow you whole. The forest doesn't care about us, but it changes us anyway. Those who walk alone for long enough become part of it. Quiet, watchful, almost like gods who have shed their human worries and fears. I don't know if I want to become like that. Maybe it's better to remember the fear, the loneliness, the endless night. Maybe that's what keeps us human. But that night, when I saw the man standing in the dark, I understood a little more about what those stories meant. The wilderness holds many secrets, but some of the deepest are not about spirits or monsters. They're about people, lost or found, who walk alone and become something else entirely. I still camp and hike in the wild, but I never forget that night. And sometimes, when the fire burns low and the trees are still, I wonder if I'm being watched by one of those silent gods. A lone figure who has learned the language of the forest and walks through it forever, just out of reach. The woods keep their secrets, and so do the men who walk through them alone. I still remember that camping trip with my roommates like it happened yesterday. Even though it's been years, it was one of those trips where we thought we had everything figured out. We picked a spot far off the main road, deep enough that the nearest neighbor was probably miles away. The whole campsite was ours, completely isolated, surrounded by thick woods and the quiet sounds of nature. At the time, that seemed perfect, peaceful, away from city noise and crowded campgrounds. We set up a big 6-person tent, even though there were only 4 of us. More space meant more comfort, or so we thought. The day was filled with the usual camping stuff. Chopping wood, setting up the fire, cooking burgers and marshmallows, and telling dumb jokes around the flames. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped, and we got ready for bed. We crawled into the tent around 11 p.m., still laughing and chatting a bit as we zipped the tent shut. The forest outside had already gone quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant hoots of owls. The air smelled like pine needles, damp earth, and smoke. Everything felt calm and normal. But then the night turned strange. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise that instantly set my nerves on edge. It was a scratching sound, slow and deliberate, almost like someone was dragging their hand along the outside of our tent as they circled it. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch scraping the fabric or a squirrel climbing on the tent poles. But the sound was different. It moved steadily around us. Scratch, 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 like slow fingers dragging the side of the tent, moving all the way around. I glanced over at my roommates. They were awake too, wide-eyed and frozen in place. I could hear the tension in their breathing, quick and shallow. The kind of quiet panic that fills a small space when no one knows what to say. For a long moment, none of us made a sound. The scratching stopped for a second, then started again a little further down the tent wall, like whoever it was had made it halfway around. I wanted to say something, to get up and check it out, but honestly, I didn't want to deal with it. I wasn't about to open the tent in the middle of the night if there was some stranger lurking outside. Could be someone with bad intentions. Maybe even an axe murderer, I thought, half joking but not really. That thought alone made my blood run cold. So instead of freaking out like the others, I just lay back down, pulled the sleeping bag over my head, and told myself it was probably some animal or a branch, or maybe even just my imagination playing tricks on me. It was easier to pretend everything was fine than to face whatever was out there. Eventually, the scratching faded away and the forest settled back into silence. We all tried to fall asleep, but I'm sure no one really did. Morning came slowly, and with the first light, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Outside, the world looked peaceful again. The sun shining through the trees, birds chirping, and a light breeze shaking the leaves. But when we unzipped the tent and stepped out, that peacefulness vanished. Around the base of our tent were footprints. Not ours, not any of ours. They were muddy, clear as day in the soft dirt, and they circled our tent completely. Small and medium-sized footprints, some overlapping, making it look like someone had walked slowly, pacing all night. We looked at them, then at each other, the uneasy silence hanging heavy in the air. No one had heard anyone approach or leave. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The idea that someone had been walking circles around us while we lay in the tent, hearing every move but never seeing a thing, was unsettling. We spent the morning scanning the area, trying to find clues. There were no signs of anyone camping nearby, no gear, no footprints leading away into the woods, just those mysterious prints around our tent. We wondered if it was a hiker, or maybe someone looking to scare campers for fun. Maybe even an animal that somehow made footprints that looked humanish, though that seemed unlikely. Nothing explained how this unknown presence had stayed so close and quiet all night. We packed up quickly that day, the atmosphere between us tense and quiet. What had started as a fun escape into the woods had turned into a weird, creepy experience we couldn't shake. For days afterward, I kept thinking about those footprints, about the scratching on the tent walls, about how close someone had been without us knowing. The woods can be peaceful, but they can also be unpredictable. They make you realize how small you are, how vulnerable, especially at night. That trip taught me to trust my gut more, and also to respect the silence and shadows of the forest a little more. Even when you think you're alone, you might not be. I never imagined that a simple walk back to camp could turn into one of the weirdest and most unnerving moments I've had in the outdoors. It wasn't a horror story, not really, but it sure felt like it in the moment. It's the kind of thing you remember for a long time, not because it was scary in the way you might think, but because it was so unexpected and surreal. It was late in the day when my friend and I finished our hike. We had planned a short trek, just a few miles through some rugged terrain, but somehow it had taken us much longer. The trail was tougher than we thought, thick with undergrowth, uneven ground, and more hills than we expected. By the time we turned back, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. We had no real choice but to head back to our campsite in the dark. The woods around us were dense and unfamiliar, with a thick canopy that swallowed the fading light. We only had our phones for light, their weak flashlights cutting small holes in the blackness ahead. I pulled up the map on my phone to check the location of our tent. Just a lonely, in the middle of a vast, uncharted green patch labeled as forest on Google Maps. We moved carefully, watching our footing over roots and rocks, trying to keep the direction straight. The silence around us was almost complete. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots crunching on dead leaves. My friend and I both felt that familiar edge of unease that comes with being alone in the dark wilderness, away from any sign of civilization. After a while, the path became less clear. We found ourselves stepping through a thick line of bushes, brushing branches aside as we tried to push forward. Our phone torches shone ahead, barely piercing the darkness that seemed to close in from every side. That's when we noticed something. At first, it was just a faint glint of light far ahead. Tiny pinpricks shining out from the shadows like stars scattered across a black sky. Then more appeared, dozens of them, all blinking and watching. Eyes, so many eyes, all focused on us. The light reflected back from what felt like an endless crowd of glowing orbs. For a few seconds, neither of us said a word. We just froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing down on us. The eyes didn't move or blink, they just watched. My mind raced through every possible explanation. What could be out here in the middle of nowhere with eyes like that? Predators? Wild animals? Something dangerous? I felt my breath catch in my throat. The sense of being surrounded, of being the ones watched instead of watching, was intense. Then, just as suddenly as the fear had gripped us, it hit me. The shape of the eyes, the way they caught the light, the slow blinking that didn't match a predator's stare. Sheep. We had walked right into a sheep field. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but also mixed with a good laugh. We had been ready to brace for some wild animal attack or something worse, and instead, it was a bunch of sheep staring at us like we were the strange intruders. We backed up slowly, keeping our light steady so we didn't startle them, but they didn't move, just stood there, calm and still, watching us like a silent audience. Their woolly bodies melted into the darkness, their eyes shining like tiny lanterns. We made our way around the edge of the field, careful not to step on any of the uneven ground or accidentally wander deeper into the flock. The sheep seemed curious but harmless. I couldn't help but wonder how many other people had found themselves in the same situation, creeping through the woods only to realize they had stumbled into a grazing patch of livestock. Eventually, the faint glow of our campfire came into view through the trees. The soft crackle of the fire and the smell of smoke were like a welcome beacon after the strange encounter. As we stepped back into the familiar warmth of our campsite, the tension slowly left my body. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I thought about how easy it was to misread the wilderness. How in the dark, familiar things turn strange, and even a field full of sheep can become a terrifying crowd of watching eyes. It was a reminder that the wilderness isn't just about the dangers lurking in the shadows, but also about how our minds fill in the blanks when faced with the unknown. I didn't see any real threat that night, just the quiet, steady presence of nature watching back. No ghosts, no monsters, just a bunch of sheep and two tired hikers learning the hard way how the dark can turn the ordinary into something unforgettable. The next morning, we laughed over coffee about our sheep scare and how it was probably the least dangerous thing we'd worried about. But even then, I knew I'd never forget that moment, standing frozen with dozens of eyes glowing in the night, waiting to find out what was really out there. We went on a water camping trip for my younger brother's graduation, something he'd been looking forward to for a long time. He didn't want a big party or a huge crowd. He just wanted a few days on the water with family, somewhere remote and quiet. My parents rented a houseboat, the kind with a covered deck and little bedrooms and a bathroom that emptied into a holding tank. Nothing fancy, just enough to be comfortable. The plan was to explore this massive lake system that stretched across miles of wooded shoreline. We'd travel during the day, swim, cook meals, fish, and anchor near the shore in the evenings to sleep. The first few nights were peaceful. Each day we cruised past endless trees, quiet coves, and cliffs that rose sharply out of the water. There was hardly anyone around. Once in a while, we saw another houseboat in the distance or a small fishing boat, but for the most part, it felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves. That sense of solitude was part of the appeal. It was just water, forest, and sky. The sunrises and sunsets were slow and beautiful, the kind that made you forget to check your phone or even what day it was. By the third night, we had gotten into a routine. My mom would help prep dinner while my dad grilled outside. My brother and I would go for a swim before the sun went down. That evening, we anchored close to a stretch of steep shoreline. The water there was calm and deep, and the trees started just a few feet back from the bank, tall and thick with undergrowth. It felt more remote than the last few spots, but we were all comfortable by then. I slipped into the water wearing just swim trunks. The coolness wrapped around me, and I drifted lazily along the shore, keeping within eyesight of the boat. The surface reflected the darkening sky in smears of purple and orange. It was peaceful. The sounds of my parents talking and the gentle slosh of water against the hull filled the background. Then, about 15 feet away, just past where the shadows from the tree line began, I saw him. He was standing perfectly still between two trees. A man, thin, maybe in his 40s or 50s, with short dark hair and a pale, bare chest. His pants were low on his hips. He wasn't holding anything, no fishing rod, no bag, nothing that explained why he was there. His hands were moving. His eyes were fixed directly on me. I didn't move at first. My brain took a second to register what I was seeing. Then everything went ice cold. My legs kicked instinctively, but I didn't splash. I just sank slightly and eased backward, hoping he hadn't noticed that I had noticed him. But he knew. He kept watching. His hands didn't stop. The fear didn't hit like a rush. It came in quietly, like a sickness spreading in my chest and stomach. I ducked my head under the water and swam back to the boat without coming up. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I was beside the ladder. I climbed up, keeping low, trying to act normal. I dried off quickly, grabbed a towel, and started helping with dinner like nothing had happened. I couldn't tell anyone right away. My brother was still in the water. I didn't want to make a scene and scare him, I needed to think, to figure out how to convince my family to move the boat without raising alarm. After dinner, I made up a reason. Something vague about the shoreline being too steep or the anchor feeling loose. I pushed it hard, kept my voice calm, and eventually they agreed. It was a hassle, but we retracted the anchor and motored across the lake to a wider inlet about a mile away. My brother joked about it. My parents groaned about having to reset everything. But I didn't care. I didn't even breathe easy until we were out in the open water, the forest behind us turning into a distant dark wall. That night I didn't sleep. I just lay in my bunk, staring out the small window, thinking about that man in the trees, thinking about how close he was, what he was doing, and worst of all, wondering how long he'd been standing there before I noticed him. The rest of the trip wasn't the same. I still swam, but only during the day and never near the shore. Every time we pulled in for the night, I scanned the tree line obsessively. Every crooked branch looked like a figure. Every dark shadow made my stomach twist. No one else saw him. I never told my family what I saw until after the trip was over. When we were home, my mom turned pale. My dad got quiet. My brother just looked at me like I was joking. But I wasn't. I don't know who that man was or why he was out there. Maybe he was living off the grid, or just some sick creep who waited by the shore for houseboats to anchor nearby. I tried to report it later, but with no photo, no exact location, and no real crime committed, there wasn't much to say. But ever since then, dark tree lines by the water make my skin crawl. When the sun drops and the woods go black, I can still see him standing there, half naked and motionless, eyes locked on mine. And every time I remember it, I think about how close he was, how nothing stopped him from coming closer, from doing worse. Just a few yards of water. That's all that separated us. Now, even years later, I stay away from isolated shorelines. I don't swim near the woods, and when I see a boat anchored close to a dark bank, I wonder if someone else is watching, just out of sight, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. It was the middle of September when I decided to go camping alone for a few days in the backcountry of northern Pennsylvania. The trees were just starting to show a hint of fall. The air had that crisp bite in the morning, and there was barely anyone out there during the week. I had gone to this particular area a few times before, and it felt familiar enough that I figured I could handle it on my own. I wasn't looking for adventure or any kind of challenge, just some quiet, some space, a break from everything. The drive up took most of the afternoon. The dirt road that led to the trailhead was rougher than I remembered, filled with deep ruts and fallen branches. I parked at the end and checked my pack one last time before heading in. I had food for 4 days, water purification tablets, 2 knives, extra socks, a lightweight tent, and a flashlight with backup batteries. I hiked in for about 3 hours before finding a flat clearing near a small stream. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, not too far from water, and with a thick wall of trees all around that made it feel like its own little pocket in the world. The first night was uneventful. I set up camp, boiled some noodles, and watched the stars come out. The quiet was almost too much at first. No distant cars, no people, just the wind through the trees and the crackling of my fire. Took a while to fall asleep, but once I did, I slept deep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of something moving nearby. Just a deer, probably. I unzipped my tent and looked out, but there was nothing. No tracks, no animals, just the sound of the stream and the wind. I ate some oatmeal and spent the day exploring the area. I followed the stream uphill for a bit, trying to find its source. There were animal tracks all over, mostly deer and raccoon, but also a few I didn't recognize. Long, narrow, almost human-like, but not quite. I figured it was a bear with some oddly shaped prints or maybe something dragging behind it. On the second night, something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, but every time I turned my head, I expected to see someone standing just behind me. The woods felt heavy. I kept the fire going longer than I needed to, and when I finally got in the tent, I lay awake for hours. Every snap of a twig outside made my chest tighten. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that definitely wasn't a deer. It was this slow, dragging sound. Something moving unevenly, like it was limping or crawling. It circled my camp once. I held my breath and gripped the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. It moved off eventually, but I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and moved camp about half a mile farther up the stream, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever had passed through. At the new site, I found signs that someone had camped there before. Charcoal from a fire, some melted plastic, even an old canteen lying in the brush. It looked like it had been there for years. I was a little uneasy, but figured it was just someone else like me, maybe a hunter or camper who hadn't cleaned up. That day was quiet. I tried to relax, made a bigger fire, cooked some rice and jerky, and even let myself feel a little better. But that night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It wasn't loud. It was soft, shallow, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening. The breathing was right outside my tent. I could hear it shift, like whoever it was leaning down or crawling. I gripped my knife and waited. Then I heard something that still makes my skin crawl. A faint whisper. So quiet I couldn't even make out the words. Just the rhythm of it. Soft, fast, desperate. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before I heard the breathing stop. And then nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. When the sun came up, I found prints. Bare feet. Small like a child's, but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too flat. They circled my tent twice and then led off into the trees. I should have left then. I know that. But something kept me there. Maybe pride. Maybe the fact that I was already so far in. Maybe some part of me didn't want to believe it was real. I told myself it was a lost kid or someone messing with me. That third day, I didn't go far. I stayed close to the fire, kept checking my gear, kept looking at the tree line. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, just beyond where I could see. I kept catching movement in the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, fed it every hour, made sure it never got too low. Just before dawn, I thought I saw someone standing across the stream. Not moving, just standing. I didn't go look. I didn't want to know. When morning came, I crossed the stream to check. There were more of those prints, and something else. A piece of cloth caught on a branch. It looked like it had been part of a dress. Thin, dirty, worn almost to shreds. Child-sized. I packed everything right then. I was done. I didn't care how far I had to hike. I just wanted out. I followed the stream downhill, faster than I should have, barely stopping. The woods were too quiet. Not a single bird, not a single squirrel. Nothing. Around midday, I passed another old camp. This one was more recent. A broken tent, a torn sleeping bag, and trash scattered everywhere. There were claw marks on a tree nearby, deep ones. I didn't stop to look for long. I kept going until I hit the road. I didn't stop to rest, just got in my car and drove. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the highway. That night, I stayed in a motel. Couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those prints, kept hearing that breathing. When I finally did doze off, I had a nightmare. I was back in the woods, lying in my tent. I could hear the whisper again, only this time I could make out the words. The poor girl was starving. You could have at least fed her your souls. I woke up gasping, heart pounding. I turned on every light in the room and sat with my back to the wall until the sun came up. I haven't gone camping since. A few months later, I looked up missing person reports in that area. There were a few. One stood out. A girl, around 12 years old, went missing with her family about 10 years earlier. They had gone camping near that same stretch of woods. Their car was found at the trailhead, but their bodies were never recovered. Just pieces, shredded tents, scattered clothes. No one ever found out what happened. There were rumors, of course. Some said it was a bear. Others said it was a drifter or a cult or something worse. But no one ever proved anything. I think about that girl sometimes. Starving, lost, or maybe something else entirely by now. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know what I heard or what those footprints meant. But I know I was close to something I wasn't supposed to see, and I think it wanted me to stay. I think it was hungry, but I left. I left before it could take anything from me, before it could make me part of whatever it had become. Maybe that's what the whisper meant. Maybe it wasn't just a voice in my dream. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wanted to remind me that I walked away when someone else couldn't. Either way, I'm done with the woods. I don't care how beautiful they are. I don't care how peaceful they seem. There are things out there that don't make sense, that don't care if you believe in them or not. And if you ever hear a whisper in the dark, something cold and close and desperate, don't listen. Don't try to understand it. Just leave. Leave before it finds you. I went camping alone in the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I had always liked doing things by myself. Hiking, fishing, even road trips, and I thought solo camping would be no different. I was wrong. It started out the same way most of my trips did. I packed up my gear the night before. A tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried food, a compact stove, headlamp, a hunting knife I always carried, and my old hiking boots. I had a reliable Jeep that I'd taken through back roads before, and I trusted it to get me to the trailhead. I had chosen a spot about 3 miles off the nearest forestry road, just a little north of Blue Mountain Lake. I didn't plan to stay more than one night. I thought I'd go in, camp, take some photos, maybe fish if I found a stream, and then head back the next day. The drive in was rough but manageable. The dirt road had washed out in a few places from a recent storm, and I had to ease over some mud and fallen branches. The air was humid, thick with that kind of earthy smell you only get deep in the woods. Once I reached the trailhead, I parked the Jeep under a thick canopy of trees, packed up my gear, locked the doors, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places but still walkable. I kept an eye out for snakes and had my knife in a side sheath just in case. I hiked for about 2 hours, crossing a couple of shallow creeks and passing under some towering pines and oaks. I didn't see another soul, which was normal for where I was. It's the kind of place people say they want to visit but never do. That suited me just fine. I found a spot near a small clearing to set up camp. The ground was flat, covered in a soft layer of pine needles and dead leaves. I set up my tent facing east so I could catch the morning light, staked it down tight, and got everything organized. I boiled water for a quick lunch, rice, and dehydrated beans. Then I walked around the area for a bit, looking for signs of wildlife. I found a few deer tracks and some scat that I figured was from a raccoon or coyote. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the place. By late afternoon, the woods started to shift. It's hard to explain, but the sounds change. The birds quiet down, the air cools, and you start to hear things that make you feel like you're not alone, even when you know you are. I felt that before and it never bothered me, but this time it lingered. I brushed it off and started a small fire as the light faded. I sat on a rock near the flames and ate another bagged meal. The fire crackled, and the heat kept the bugs away. I had my back to the tent and watched the woods in front of me. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. Around 10 p.m., I put out the fire, climbed into my sleeping bag, and zipped the tent shut. I lay there for a while, listening. The wind moved through the trees in waves, and I could hear a few insects chirping and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Normal forest stuff. Then something changed. It wasn't a big, dramatic shift, just a pause, like everything took a breath and held it. At first, I thought I imagined it, but I sat up a little and listened harder. It was dead quiet. No bugs, no wind, nothing. That's when I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps. Not animal-like, heavy, human. I froze. They were coming from the direction of the trail I had used. One step, then a pause. Another step, another pause. Whoever it was, they weren't using a flashlight. That struck me immediately as strange. If you're in the forest at night and not using light, it's either because you're trying not to be seen or because you know exactly where you're going. I stayed perfectly still. My knife was in my boot, and I didn't want to risk making noise getting it. The footsteps stopped maybe 30 yards from my tent. I held my breath. There was no talking, no crunch of gear or movement after that. Just silence. I lay there, heart hammering, for maybe 20 minutes before I finally reached for my knife and clutched it tight. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slow, like it knew something was off. When the sky started to lighten, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. Everything looked normal. My gear was undisturbed, and nothing seemed out of place. I looked around for tracks but didn't see any clear ones. The ground was soft in some areas, and I thought I might find footprints, but if they were there, they weren't obvious. I kept telling myself maybe I had heard a deer or a bear walking upright. Maybe I was just on edge and turned something small into something big. That's what I told myself. Still, I decided to pack up. I didn't want to stay a second night. I moved quickly, rolled up my tent, and stuffed everything into my pack. I kept my knife out the whole time. I didn't eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The trail back felt different. Every sound had weight to it. Every squirrel darting through leaves made my chest jump. About halfway back to the Jeep, I started noticing something that made my stomach sink. Broken branches. Not random ones either. These looked intentional. Snapped off about shoulder height, one every 30 or 40 feet. I hadn't noticed them on the way in, and they weren't clean breaks like wind damage. It was more like someone had twisted them until they snapped. I counted 6 of them in a row, all on the same side of the trail. Then I found the first piece of cloth. It was small, maybe the size of a bandana, caught on a thorn bush just off the trail. Dark blue. I didn't own anything that color. I left it where it was and kept moving. The air felt thicker somehow, like the forest was watching. I finally reached the Jeep. Everything looked the same from a distance, but when I got closer, I saw the driver's side mirror was pushed inward like someone had bumped into it. That could have been anything. Maybe a branch fell or a deer brushed past. But then I noticed the tire tracks. Mine coming in were clear, but there were others. Faint, but they were there. Wide set, deeper tread. Not fresh, but not old either. Looked like maybe a truck had pulled in and backed out while I was gone. I got in fast and locked the doors. I started the engine and backed out of the trailhead, watching the trees in the rearview mirror. My hands were shaking. I kept checking behind me for miles. I didn't feel okay until I hit pavement again. Even then, I kept checking my rearview, half expecting someone to be following me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about 30 miles away. I went inside, used the bathroom, washed my face, and sat there in the parking lot for a long time. I tried to put it out of my mind after that. I told a few friends about the trip, but I didn't mention the footsteps or the broken branches. I didn't want to sound paranoid. A week later, though, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was cleaning out the back of the Jeep and noticed something wedged in the seam between the back seat and the floor. It was a piece of folded paper. I didn't remember seeing it before. I unfolded it, expecting it to be trash. Maybe a receipt or something I dropped. It wasn't. It was a photo. An old one, grainy and creased. It showed a man standing in the woods, staring straight at the camera. He was wearing what looked like military fatigues, his face partly in shadow. No smile, no movement, just standing there. I turned the photo over. Nothing written on the back. No dates, no locations, nothing. I sat there staring at it for a long time. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it got into my car. I keep thinking maybe I dropped my pack and someone slipped it in. Maybe I left the Jeep unlocked at some point. I don't know. I still don't know. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been camping since. I don't think I'll ever go alone again. I keep the photo in a drawer now, buried under other papers. Sometimes I take it out just to remind myself it was real, that I didn't imagine it. I don't have answers, but I know what I felt out there. I know someone was in those woods, watching, waiting, not a ghost, not some legend, just a person. And that's what makes it worse, because people are real, and people don't always need a reason.